Welcome, everyone, to this special video episode of Peace for Everybody, a podcast to co create a culture of peace that begins in our bodies, where together we're creating new pathways in our nervous systems, our daily lives, and in our collective body around the globe. Today, we're having a very exciting conversation with special guest Verena Fisch. I am your host, Franka R. I am an international social worker, peace researcher, and Kundalini yoga teacher. And I'm very excited to be having a very fruitful and nourishing conversation with Verena today on the topic of tending to our human nature, what community gardens can contribute to building a new eco-social world. Welcome, Verena.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Would you also like to shortly introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Verena Fisch. I'm a PhD student at Glasgow Caledonian University. So I'm talking to you from Scotland, from Glasgow today. And as you, Franca, I studied international social work and development, and then I switched to a more ecological perspective. Sorry, and I did my master's in environment, politics, and development. And now in my PhD, I focus on the relationships between people and plants.
Which is exactly what we're talking about today. It would be nice to start off just so that we're all on the same page, talking about community gardens. Maybe you could illustrate a little bit what community gardens are.
So I think community gardens, it's very difficult to define what a community garden exactly is, but we definitely have to distinguish it from like private backyard gardens or private allotment gardens. So a community garden really is part of a community, is in a community, a certain neighborhood, and is open to everyone who wants to come to visit or to garden. And decisions about the garden are made collectively. So it's not that one person decides what to plant and when to harvest, but it's a collective, ideally. um, so yeah, community gardens are very often found in urban areas. So it's a green space in the midst of a grey desert, and it provides a lot. It can provide food for people, but it also just the beauty of growing flowers, for example. So there are very, very different modes of community gardening.
And what can community gardens then offer in terms of looking at the relationship between humans and plants?
Well, I would say that a garden per se is always a co creation of human efforts and non human efforts. So it's always something that is not only made by humans, because humans don't really grow the tomato, but the plant grows the tomato, and humans care for the plant. So it's always like something that is grown together in a way between human beings and other than human beings. So I think we can learn a lot from community gardens and how we can observe these relationships between people and plants, but then also animals, for example, like all the animals you can find in the gardens, like squirrels or even slugs. Like the relationships between people and slugs is something very, very interesting. It sounds a bit weird, but it actually is. And there have been studies about this, how people describe their relationships with so-called pests, but then also so-called weeds, for example. Like not every plant is welcome in a community garden.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a very inclusive, but also very exclusive space, in a certain way. Yeah.
Hmm. That's interesting in terms of like when we speak of transferring kind of concepts that we usually see as social concepts and see how they play out in a community garden. So maybe it's a way of things just become more visible when we kind of open the space into a eco-social and don't see those as two separate things, but as kind of a one thing together. So I think there are very different levels on which community gardens make different things visible. Do you have maybe some examples from like the smaller to like wider, more conceptual and theoretical concepts that we can see are touched on with community gardens?
Sure. I mean, one thing is, as I said, the planting of specific species of plants, either for beauty, because we like the flowers, for example, but then also for simple reason of we need to eat, so we grow our own food. And I think when it comes to foods, there is many things that we usually don't see. So this entire production line of where our food comes from, the food that we get in the supermarket, where it is grown, the hours and hours of work that goes into growing food, whether that is done by machines or whether that is done by plants or by humans. But then also all the substances that go into, well, let's stick with a tomato. um, for example, fertilizers, insecticides, and so on, or even in organic farming, organic fertilizers, um, but then also nutrients from the soil, right? So all these elements that then in the end up to be a tomato that we then consume in a way, um, are so much more visible in a community garden when people actually go and put the work in themselves, whether that is physical work, whether that is mental work, whether that is like just tending and caring for a plant that then grows your tomato or bean or cucumber or whatever you're growing. So yeah, it is very interesting because people start to think about very political topics, but it does not necessarily have to be in a very political way. So sometimes community gardens occupy spaces in very central areas, very urban areas where the space is very often community gardens are in the way. You know, space is very limited in urban centers, so even the physical space that is a garden instead of a high-rise building is a form of resistance, as some say.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously the entire food production topic, the use of fertilizers, all of these things that are being discussed in a very global way. Food security is a topic, or even gentrification is another topic. But then also when we think about who gets to garden in a community garden, like as I said, it is a space that is very inclusive but then exclusive at the same time. So who has a garden in their neighborhood, for example, and then who gets to come there and actually spend time there, and who doesn't. So this question of who's excluded is also a question for people in community gardens as it is for plants and for animals, for example. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I think speaking of organic farming, it's so interesting when people are active in a community garden and really develop this deep care for the plants and for the garden and for the practices that work for this specific space and to create and co-create with nature and the plants and the animals and more mushrooms, bacteria, and all the things.
Yeah.
How it relates to our relationship that we have with our own body as like the first primary environment that we kind of live in. If we would see like our body as a garden and then in a way like a community garden, the society that's made up of all the different bodies, and transfer these concepts, how all the relationships that are active in gardens also are related to our body intelligence and the embodied way how we move through the world. And I think sometimes it's easier for people to, you know, care for the carrot plant throughout her whole life cycle and make sure that she gets enough water and, you know, figure out whatever she needs, than to have this comprehension of ourselves as bodies or like, you know, our soil. um, yeah, so and then it's from this more like more individual experience of being as a body in a community garden and caring for the outside, but also then taking this back internally. um, Community gardens, I think, are also like an entryway to just cultivate with landscape and nature in a wider sense, our relationship, when we talk more like decolonial perspectives of which land do we live on and what's our relationship with that land. Do you have any experiences in terms of community gardens, like maybe some examples how these communities that are together taking care of a garden relate to the environment that's outside of the garden, as mostly it's like in urban areas?
Well, in terms of decolonization, there's an entire movement, Decolonize the Garden, that asks those important questions of where do the plants come from that we grow in, well, in my case, the United Kingdom, in our gardens. Where do those plants originate and who brought them to the environment that we grow them today? That is obviously a big topic. And then also the names of plants, for example, who are plants named after. That's a very obvious thing. But then again, it's a question of access. So do minority groups, for example, have access to community gardens, or is it the white middle class that governs these gardens? That's one thing. And I think well, if those gardens are located in urban centers, one might think that the diversity of people that we can find in bigger cities is kind of reflected in the gardening population. But that is not always the case, unfortunately. I think it is getting, or there's movement in the right direction, I would say, but it is still sometimes very exclusive against Black people, people of color, any minority groups really. But there is, as I said, Decolonize the Garden is a very inclusive movement and a very holistic movement in a way, that looks at plants, but then also people. Like colonial structures are unfortunately everywhere. So yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah, I think a very important part of this whole discourse on decolonization is also the how do we relate to the more than human world.
Yeah.
So maybe I would like to dive a little bit more also in the relationship between humans and plants. As you said, is also your focus of your PhD research. Do you have a favorite plant?
It changes. At the moment, my favorite plant is my tiny little cactus that is on my windowsill over there. It's just growing a flower, and that makes me very happy. So yeah, but then I don't really have a favorite plant. I think it's incredible how and I see that in the research I did like 2 years ago, where I talked to social workers who had professional experience with community gardens. So they worked with their service users, with people in community gardens, and they described how for people who came to these gardens, the relationships with the plants, with the trees in these gardens, was just as important than the relationships with other human beings. So there is something, and I think that is something that I want to find out in my PhD, is the relationships that people have with plants as other living beings seem to be very important, but sometimes, I think most of the time, we disregard them completely because plants are not seen as something um, as something, or if we think about the hierarchy of life that we very often think in. Unfortunately, plants are at a very low level, right? So we have people, and then we have animals, and there's like so many groups that advocate for animal rights, and that obviously is very important. But then when we see plants as living beings and as agents, if we give agency to plants, what does that do with our worldview, really? If we have a more round and less hierarchical worldview, and we give agency to plants, how do we treat plants? How do we interact with plants? How do we co-create a space like a community garden with plants, for example? And I think I think many people do have a favorite plant from my experience. They could tell you everything about that plant, how it grew, and when it flowered the first time, about the fruits, whatever the living conditions of a certain plant. So I think people do have these relationships, and specifically in community gardens. And I think that's another thing that community gardens really make visible is those special relationships, and they are places where those relationships are allowed to be and to be sustained and yeah, as something just very positive. And then people describe this as very relaxing, as a form of therapy, as like there's so much research about the benefits of community gardens, right? um,
Mm-hmm.
and then the question is how much of those benefits is actually due to plants and not due to other people and these gardens. And I don't know that yet, but
Mm-hmm.
just as a way of thinking about gardens, I think it's very interesting. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also since, the trend is like kind of relating to nature as part of your self-care routine, that, oh,
Yeah.
I need to go for a walk like once a week or every day. For a little bit, I would just go to the park or, whatever is available to the forest. Which you also see in like this trendy kind of concepts of bathing in the forest bathing, or what it's called in English. And I think it's very interesting the way you talk about the different facets of a relationship with plants, to kind of deconstruct that one-sided, I'm going to nature because it's good for my physical and mental wellness, into it's like the web of life that we move together in, and to shift our awareness into noticing what's going on all the time. So maybe I also have favorite plants. I'm just thinking about it as I'm looking outside. I do have some specific trees that I really like. um, but then I also notice some plants in my home, I do not really have an active relationship with them, or um, I think there's this. It's either you are crazy because you talk with your plants, or no relationship with your plants. Do you have any tips how to open up our awareness to this more than human species that we are in relationship with?
Talk to your plants, really. I can definitely recommend that. And it sounds a bit weird, but plants, and again, there's research about that. Plants can receive sound waves. So just as plants feel touch, for example, in a way, and plants have a form of memory in a way, and they can remember movements and touch again. So I think there are ways of connecting with plants in ways that are more familiar to us. And it might not seem like that. It might seem weird to talk to plants or like pet your plants. And I'm not sure if they would like that. But I think we need to start to think about plants in a different way and give them more agency and think about them um, in ways that they are actually not just passive, um, but they are active. They're actively contributing to the environment that we live in and that we depend on, right? I mean, plants, we eat plants, we breathe the oxygen that comes from plants. If there's anything in this world that we really rely on, it is plants. Um,
Mhm.
and sometimes, or like very often, we just don't treat plants like that. And this is like a big scale and like deforestation of literally any forest, really, I guess. Um, but then also in terms of plants in our garden, private gardens or community gardens. And yeah, plants are much more than just a bunch of green leaves, I would say.
I agree. I agree. It's yeah, the way you talk about plants being able to receive sound waves and having a very subtle memory and intelligence. I think this can very much help us get access also to that our bodies kind of function in the same way, just from the kind of biophysical material that we're made of. It also remembers touch. It also has this subtle awareness and this memory that whatever we go through in life is kind of saved and stored in our bodies, in our cells, and then beyond our lifetime also epigenetically from our ancestors. And just I think it's so interesting how these two things go together, how opening our awareness to be in relationship with plants also includes us on this one side of the relationship, in understanding ourselves better, as that we are also having this organic way of functioning, that we're also environments in and of ourselves that in the kind of modern lifestyle is often not tended to in the way we work and the way we live. Um, so how do community gardens or communities in community gardens um, relate to plants as part of the community? Are there like any concrete practices that are done to make sure that it's just not a bunch of people planting a bunch of plants, but how does this become a community in the garden?
Um, I think it's the caring about each other that makes the community. So, as people, we care about each other in a family or in a chosen community of any form. And I think in a community garden, the community is just more than human. So that kind of community is made up of human beings, but then also of plants and of animals and the soil, the land where these plants grow, and also like the rain, the water that sustains the plants, and so on. So there are many elements and many other than human actors that come to a garden and make it the community. And form the basis of the community. Like without plants, a community garden wouldn't be a community because there would be no garden. So yeah, I think generally what you just said, I think is very true, that the way we treat plants in a garden or outside a garden is often very similar to the way we treat ourselves. So I think if we manage to get a better relationship with our natural environment, natural meaning not human environment, um, I think it would be a very important step in having a better relationship with ourselves and other human beings as well, because we would realize, or we would think more about and reflect about what it means to care about something and how caring for each other can look like. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just love how community gardens are kind of this portal openers to really have an experience of what that means, what we're talking about. Because for some people, it's like too theoretical, or it's too much out there, or like some of these concepts are too spiritual and not tangible enough. And I think also the way you describe who comes together in a community garden are very different people, some of which are very politically active, some just want to make their own, grow their own plants and eat them in the end. I think it's just very, very important to have this kind of spaces to de intellectualize also the ways in which we're trying to create a new world and new ways of relating with each other. Um, that's just a very hands-on experience, and then for somebody it can be like a spiritual practice, and for someone it can be just the uh, it doesn't have to be theorized in a way.
No,
So how's it for you?
for me.
Yeah, because you do theorize also, but you also have the hands-on practice of being active in the community garden.
Um, I think it's a mix, and I think that is why I find it so interesting, because it just never gets boring in any way. So, as you said, it can be something that I just do, like watering plants for an hour can be just very relaxing and almost like a form of meditation, because you just you focus on water, you focus on the plants, and like on what you're doing with your hands in a way. Um, but then it can also be very political, and it can be a form of activism, or it can be related to other forms of activism. It can be a space for political action and collective action specifically, and I think that is important because we live in a world where we are more and more individualized. So having and that goes for plants and for people, by the way, I think. So having a space where we can experience, in a way, this interconnectedness, like very hands-on, is just super important also for me. And obviously I like to ask people about their experience, which is why I'm doing this as researcher as well. So I don't think I can draw a line between my personal gardening experience and my researching gardening experience. Yeah, I don't think I need to, but yeah.
No, I think that's the, next level research. It's kind of a holistic practice. That's not either or, but how do we make sense of the world with like all of our senses?
Yeah.
Are there any, is there, if I want to find a community garden, are there any go-to websites that I can search, or is it just locally I can find some for maybe someone who got curious and would like to check that out?
I mean, I could recommend you gardens in Glasgow. I'm not sure if this is helpful. Generally, community gardens is something that is become more and more popular across the world, really. Some gardens might not use the term community garden,
Mm-hmm.
but I think you can find those spaces where people come together to grow food, or flowers, or generally edible and non-edible plants, together in almost everywhere. So I think the principle of a community garden, wherever you are, I'm pretty sure you'll find some.
Yeah, so if you just needed a little bit of encouragement and a little push and you've been thinking about it, just try some different, Google searches or different searches.
And I mean, if
To
there's no space where you are, then why don't you just start one?
Yeah. So where is the future of community gardens?
I
How
think
do you see the
there's
future?
how do I look into my plant pot. No. Um,
And what I see
and what I see
is
is growing. No, I think the spaces become more and more important. Obviously, that the trend, the social trend, I would say, goes towards local communities, towards local collectives, I would say. And people realize that they feel uncomfortable with like this individualistic and this progress and growth driven society that we live in, because like the vast majority of people is unhappy in a way, or unhealthy and whatever. So I think people more and more look for alternatives or spaces where they can engage in. So I think we don't need to worry about the extinction of community gardens anytime soon. um, yeah, and I really hope that people go and cherish these spaces, in one way or the other. As I said, there's so many different ways to engage with gardens. I think everybody can find their way to just be, and contribute in a way, um, and learn something about plants and about gardening and about other people or the city they live in, and obviously a lot about themselves, I would say.
and the way their bodies are also talking to them.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah,
Mm. I think it's just also important to say, like, to close this off, that community gardens are not meant to teach us like that we need to go back to something how we used to live
no.
more in touch with nature, but that it can be an integrated part of also a more technological and digital age. And it's more about the capacity to be in touch with and feel part of the whole of nature, even when we live in a city and we have our life and we just go to a community garden once in a week. I think it's nice to see where this can go in finding just new ways of being with all of it.
Yeah.
And it's also okay to have like a normal apartment in a city, some plants inside it, and work on a laptop every day. And we can still feel like the oneness and build a new eco-social world altogether. Yes, so thank you so much for this interesting conversation.
Thanks
I
for
really
having me.
like the many aspects that we could touch on to just show how community gardens are really can be safe spaces to explore this relationship with ourselves and with the more than human communities as well. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find more interesting topics on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and other platforms if you look for Peace for Everybody. And yeah, with this, I wish you a very peaceful day, and may the peace extend to everybody and every plant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.